All right, so right now I'm sharing a little JavaScript web application that says online hardware store. Let me know if any issues with that. Let's actually talk at a glance real quick about like where the capability is to even capture errors and where it kind of like fits in with the platforms we have today. So if you're new to Sentry, this would be the first place you might log into. To create a project in Sentry, we cover all the platforms and languages, but I'm going to focus on JavaScript with a backend in Python just for the first few minutes of demo here. But do bear in mind, we just had a product launch for serverless, and we always have new SDKs and platforms that we're continually supporting. So when you do go to create one of these, it's going to actually give you a little key to your app that you can then use to install for your application. So here's our agenda for today. We're starting out with this little demo and going to see some of the capabilities here, and then we'll look at the full setup a little later and some other cool things. So here's a JavaScript app. The Sentry SDK is already installed, so let's just kind of see it live in action. So we add things into our shopping cart, no problems yet, but the SDK is recording some information under the hood, but it's not going to make any requests to Sentry.io unless there's an actual error. So everything traditionally is very error driven. So at this point, the user has a problem. They might call support, and together they're pretty unable to debug what happened. Like no one's really staring down the logs in Google Chrome, nor on the server side. So this kind of brings us to the first problem that Sentry solves, and that is getting alerted about your problems. So I have a little alert set up here in Slack Messenger, but bear in mind, we have a new integration with Microsoft Teams and a lot of other alert mechanisms and tools, even a webhook integration. But let's just start from kind of the front-end developer mindset here. And looks like we have a channel of just all the JavaScript developers. And if you have too many developers, it might be hard to know like who's going to take this. But you can totally customize your alerts based on maybe a URL that they came from. Like, was it the sign-up page? Maybe you want that going to a specific channel, or what file of code is throwing the error. You could have that alert go to a separate channel or developer as well. So here, it looks like we got a 500 error on, or 500 response from the server. So let's actually click into this. So this is kind of the bread and butter, the product here. Let's kind of start with the header because there's a lot of information on the screen, but we'll kind of break it down. So this is how many unique times this event happened and how many users were impacted. So this happened 490 times, and these were grouped together into the same issue. So that's why you hear this called the issue page sometimes. And the reason why these were grouped together was because the default grouping algorithm was in place, and that's the stack trace. So Sentry.io, it looks at these events and it evaluates, was this a unique stack trace that it's seen before or not? So it found that 490 times this series of functions in a call stack were executed and errored on this line of code. So that's why these 490 were grouped together into this particular issue. So also on this stack trace here, you can see the original minified form. You do need to upload source maps ahead of time so that you can see the unminified form here. Okay. So of those 490, what may have been different across those were the tags. So properties on each individual occurrence of this issue for each event. So what browser recorded this, who's the user, about 10 of these or so are set by default by the Sentry SDK, depending on what platform you're in, but you can always instrument some of your own. For instance, I added one in my source code called customer type. So as I load in my customer object into JavaScript in the web app, I can indicate what customer is being affected here. So moving down, we have a heat map here that shows the distribution of values for those tags across all 490 of those. And similar to this, we have an events tab here if you wanted to look at an analysis of those events and really kind of compare attributes for each event. But we recommend clicking open and discover so you can do a better analysis in there. And I'll show that at the end of my session. And you can also flip through each of the individual events here, clicking older and newer, but they'll all have the same stack trace. So moving down, we have breadcrumbs. These are to reproduce the problem. So we see the final error occurred here at this particular timestamp, and that was preceded by an HTTP request to the backend to try and purchase those tools in the tool store. And there was a series of logs in the console, as well as HTTP requests, and any DOM modifications are here as well. So those are things that are collected by default. And as a developer, you might not always remember what every div or button refers to. So that's why we recommend adding some of your own breadcrumbs, like we did here. So user adds item to shopping carts. That's a lot more human readable. Moving down, some additional metadata is collected here. And finally, the additional data This is good for object form data whose value you want to know in event of an error. So I went out of my way to capture the value of the shopping cart right when I click checkout. I want like an immutable copy of what was in JavaScript in that variable, because maybe that's different than what the user sees or than what's in the database. Okay. So now that we see that it was pretty normal activity in the breadcrumbs, like user adding things to cart, and we see that we handled a 500 response here. So we did not get a 200, and we just threw an error. So maybe we want a little bit more insight into what happened on the back end. So I set a transaction ID in JavaScript as a tag, and then I actually communicated that on the HTTP request to the backend, to my server side in the endpoint, where I applied the same transaction ID. And this is a practice we have pretty thoroughly covered in documentation, and we even have some updates on how this works later if you attend the performance session. You'll see how it does this for you. So if we click on that transaction ID and say we want to see all the errors that have this ID, regardless of the project they're coming from. So here's that ID. We could see that not only did we handle a 500 response in JavaScript and throw an error, but it looks like we also had an error in Python on the server side. So this is cluing me into what may have happened. So let's glance at this one real quick. We see that now this is a Python event. As we scroll down, we have some tags relating to a Python runtime. And then the stack trace here, we can see that there was not enough inventory for that item, so we raise an exception. And some other cool things that you'll find in various languages is that you can see the stack locals, as these were provided with the exception by Python. So you can see what was actually being iterated through this for loop here, or the process order function. And then on any backend SDK, you'll get the request payload too, the body. So you can check if there's any missing IDs or malformed data that might be causing a problem or failure to find the item in the database. So request headers that came in on that request are here. And finally, packages that were used at time of that error as well. So now let's go back to that JavaScript error and kind of talk through like what developers might be doing once they're at this little page here and kind of figuring out what to do. So let's say you're triaging this. A couple quick things you could do. For one, if you need more time to work on it and you're still getting alerts, you could hit ignore. And that's just a snooze button on the alert. The event will keep coming in. It comes in at maximum every 5 minutes, but you can fully configure that. If this was an error that you decided does not impact user experience, you could delete it and discard it in the future by selecting this option. And this will set a filter for you so that if it comes in a 492nd time, it will actually get dropped and it won't count towards your quota. But I'll show us in the next section how we can set some of our own filters that are a little more powerful than this. Let's say you want to assign to a developer. So a couple ways we might go about that. We have a lot of integrations with different issue tracking softwares. So for instance, a list of them are here, Bitbucket, GitLab, and so forth. If we click link Jira issue, it will start creating a Jira issue for us. It'll map these fields to Jira, and we have a bidirectional sync, so you could close out the issue on either side, or link to an existing issue if you think someone already opened them there in your Jira instance. Sentry can also make some recommendations for us for who to assign this to. So that's what suggested assignees are about. And where this comes from is actually a feature called suspect commit. So let me take a second to explain that. Every time an error comes into Sentry, Sentry looks at each file in the stack trace and can compare them to recent commits of your code that updated one or more of those files. So you have to set up your integration with your source code versioning tool ahead of time in your work settings. But once you do that, Sentry will find, like in this example, that there were 6 commits that updated either app.js or something else in the stack trace. And it's important that we compare versus all the files, because maybe this is not the file that you actually need to make an update in. Maybe it's not actually breaking the code. Maybe it was a bad argument upstream that was being passed. But we can say with some certainty that at least here are some developers that have committed code that is now erroring. So they've updated this code. They're probably familiar with this code base. So they're a decent bet for someone for who to assign this to. And here's some of the commits that those developers offered. Okay, so that's suggested assignees. You can also have this get automatically assigned to someone within Sentry. So if we click create ownership rule, it's going to show us 3 pieces of information about our event here. So here's the URL that it happened on. Here's the file path that it happened from in my project. So components app.js was that tool store. So if I select it here, then I can say who is the person or the team that I want this to get assigned to, then click the plus here. So this is saying any errors at all that come from app.js get assigned to this person. So you can also do this for different URLs. You can hand type them here. When we get into the next section on alerts and ownership, we'll go into more detail on things we can do in here. Okay. So now let's take a look at the next section on workflow. Okay. So Sentry captures errors, right? That's kind of like the first thing that might pop into our minds when we think about it. But really, we see it as more of like a workflow, an overall debugging solution that we want you to integrate into your CI/CD process for fixing problems to free up your developers' time so they're not spending majority of their time fixing problems from code that was already deployed. So here's kind of the vision. As we all know, it's easy to install an SDK. That's the first step if you haven't used Sentry before. And just to talk through the workflow, you get alerted about errors, people on your team are notified. In this section in the middle is where you're logged into Sentry.io and triaging it. And then finally, you might open an issue in a project management tool. And then finally, commit the code changes and redeploy. And make sure you track this per release or version of your code. So just to show us some of the integrations that you can use to solve different parts of this for alerting or issue tracking, we've got a full dashboard of them to let you know if they've been set up or not in Sentry. And it's important to think about what problems they're solving. So in terms of issues, which is kind of this section in the middle here, we support Jira, Clubhouse, Trello, and a lot more. If you're thinking about alerting and you want to solve that problem, so that's kind of in the beginning here. We have PagerDuty, Slack, Microsoft Teams, Twilio, and a lot more. And we also have a webhooks integration that you can see later in a presentation about how you can have like an alert or an event payload get forwarded to a URL of your choice. Okay. So let's take a look at how to set up some alerts, because we saw a basic one in action, but let's look a little more at what we can do and then revisit issue owners and issue tracking. So I'm going to pull up my alerts dashboard. Here we go. So if we go to alerts, there's two basic types of alerts today. So there are metric alerts and issue alerts. Let's start with issue alerts, and then we'll transition to metrics. So these are scoped to individual issues happening. This could be the first time an issue ever happens. It's brand new. And you can add a condition saying you want to make sure it happens to X number of users or a certain number of times in an interval. And that's what these conditions are about in here. You can also have it based on a tag. So remember earlier, I set a tag for customer type. So I could say that some tag or value has a certain value here. So that makes sure that the alert only happens for that customer or something else. And then finally, what are the actions we want to perform? So I went with a Slack notification, but we do support a lot of other programs. And if you select via an integration, here's where you can select that webhook integration that you set up. So now the problem with this is that you could do something like, say, it happens 100 times in a minute. But the problem here is that if you have, say, like 200 issues that are all hitting 99 per minute, well, that might be a lot of overall volume for your project, but it's still not quite triggering this issue alert because it has to be 100 for one issue. So this is where metric alerts are going to be your friend, because these are about exceeding an overall threshold that's project-wide, and it's not specific to an individual issue. So from here, our only filter is going to be the fact that it's an error. Then you can say we want to get notified about this if it reaches 100 per minute. And we'll consider it resolved if it dips down to 80. So here the example, maybe the average error volume was like 80 per minute. So if it hits 100, it's active, people are getting notified. But then if it hovers at like 98 for 48 hours, maybe it's not really fixed. So that's why you put a resolve status. Then you take your same actions from here. And another neat thing, this is for all errors for this particular front-end React project, but you can make it for errors from a specific URL if you wanted to within your app. So I think of it as like a specific product functionality or user experience. You could even do a specific file name if you wanted to. Or if you had an exact issue ID, you could put that here. And then it's essentially an issue alert all over again. But notice the key theme here is that you can do it based on any piece of metadata or no metadata at all for that particular project. Okay. So now let's look at a good example with issue ownership. So let me pull up a project here. then if we go into issue owners, here's where we set lots of rules. So earlier I showed a particular error from the checkout workflow in my tool store, but here's where we could set a lot of rules. So I want to focus on this one right here. Let's pretend that in my code base for this React application, maybe like 10% of my code is in some subdirectory within the project called critical. So what this is saying is, if an error comes from any file within the critical subdirectory, then assign it to the team heroes. Otherwise, if an error happens from anywhere else, maybe in one of my 50 different React components, then assign it to team everyone else. So the code behind this one, just to kind of show, to help you visualize that project structure, here's the source from my app, index is the entry point. Maybe a small percentage of my code is actually in critical here. So if a critical issue happens, then that means the file path on it is critical/index.js, which meets the condition for critical/star. But otherwise, anything that's happening from my many components in this components or a middleware, anything else in this app will get assigned to everyone else. So you can put as many different conditions here as you want. And then another neat thing you could do is tag. So if you wanted to get things assigned to a certain person, you could put the customer type tag name here, and then whatever the value is. So if you have enterprise customers, and then who do you want that to get assigned to? Okay, so that's issue owners. Issue tracking is just a matter of going into settings, your org settings, and kind of adding your integrations. And we have documentation on if there's anything you have to do from that side of the integration for that GitHub instance or wherever it is. Let's take a look at setup so we can see how to do like a basic SDK install. So wherever you download Sentry into, whether it's like a Maven dependency in Java or an NPM module in JavaScript, you're always going to be initializing the package. So the only one thing at the minimum that you need is the data source name key, which you get when you create your project, like I showed on my first screen. Two quick things you don't want to forget are the environment attribute as well as the release attribute, because the environment attribute allows you to indicate that it came from a staging or production or which production environment, and release is going to be a version of your code as well. Okay. Another thing on release automation, let me just show you first like a little picture of where that actually gets written. So here's my example of where I'm specifying the release from an environmental variable, 1.1, 2.0, major, minor releases, as well as the environment here. So this is important because when you actually have an error, you want to know which environment it incurred on here. So another thing on install and setting up is that you want to make sure you just create your project once. You don't want to have React-staging, React-prod. You just want to have one project and make sure that whatever environment it's running on, make sure you've set that environment tag, because you're going to see this environment's top-level filter all over Sentry.io, from discover, issues, performance, and more. So another thing on release management, you can set that attribute yourself, but do visit our documentation here because we have integrations for a lot of these tools to help you automate how you manage those releases and set the numbers. So do check these out, and I'll post links to all these tabs in the Slack forum afterwards. One other thing that pertains more to JavaScript is uploading your source maps ahead of time. So we have a Sentry CLI tool where you can call this command and put the path to your source maps, and this way they'll be uploaded to the Sentry server, and if you have an error, you'll get that unminified stack trace. Okay. So another question that comes up, if you have monolith versus microservice architecture, generally for creating projects in Sentry, you want to have the project created once. And a project is basically like an application. So if you have like a code base that correlates to an application or microservice, then just create a project for that microservice. Okay. So now let's take a look at data flow. So let me pull up a slide I have on this. So this is the overall data flow in Sentry.io. You install the SDK in your apps, it collects events and sends them to Sentry.io. Think of this as kind of like our data pipeline internally. And these are some of the things that you can do to manage what events you actually consume and get counted versus your quota, as well as how to data scrub them and even group them differently before they get saved into the database. So I'm going to show these three here, and you can actually perform these within the app SDK as well, like on the client side where the SDK is installed. So let's start with filtering. So if we go to my project settings and then we click inbound filters, There's a lot of easy ones we can just turn on here, and I'm not going to walk us through each individual one, but one thing to point out, if you ever selected delete and discard on an issue, you can then find those here, and you can undo that if you needed to. So this was the button I showed on the original issue page at the start of the demo. So some useful ones in here are filtering by release. So sometimes mobile users are refusing to upgrade your latest apps, or maybe you have web applications and like outdated versions of those that are being accessed. You could put the release number here so that you drop any events that come in for those outdated releases from months ago. Another useful one is filtering by error message. So what you do is you put the error type, :space message. So let me just show us a quick example of that. So in this case, the error type is just error. It's not range error. It's not arithmetic error. It's just error. So that's why this would be error, :space this. And you can use wildcards in here. So if you had something like, not enough inventory for, then instead of nails or hammer, you could just put star. So in the tool store earlier, sometimes the error comes in, it tells you what individual item is lacking, so you can use a star. If you have very specific error or like custom classes, you could put your custom class here and then just say, drop all of these essentially, just star all. So that's very useful as well. So another thing you can do on the server side in the UI is data scrubbing. So let's take a look at that. So in our project settings, we come to security or privacy. We have a default data scrubber turned on for you. You can mark additional sensitive fields that you don't want scrubbed, safe fields as well. And then we have an advanced data scrubber too. So let's take a look at some of the functionality here. So we have additional fields that we can scrub against that are listed in here. You can also put your own regexes. So you could put a regular expression here for something like patient name. If they do patient dash name, patient underscore name in your model and schema, and you're concerned about that coming through, put a regex for it, and then indicate, do you want that value to be hashed or masked or removed before it gets saved into the database? So that is the advanced data scrubber. Another thing you can do is grouping your issues through the UI. So this would be in your general settings here. And to show a good example of this, I'm going to bring up a guide. So sometimes in Sentry in your issues list, you might have the same issue appearing multiple times. And each of those may only differ by one small piece of information. For instance, here, the host name is slightly different between the first one and the second one. And that's kind of annoying if this comes in 10 different times. So what we could do is we can say, okay, if an error comes in and has this message of safe HTTP connection pool, host star. So it doesn't matter what that server IP address is or name. We're just saying we want to group this together using this as the fingerprint. So in this case, those 10 would get merged into one. And you could also do it based on the error type if you wanted to. So if you wanted all your connection timeouts to get merged together into one issue, then this would do that. So this would not be using the stack trace. So if you have 10 different issues with completely different stack traces, but that all were connection timeouts, if you want those all separate, then don't use this. But if you're okay with those merging together, then you can set this. Okay, so that was doing those from the server side. So now let's take a look how to do some of these from the application side. So for filtering, wherever you initialize the Sentry SDK, there's always this callback function you can pass to it called before send. So this works in all of our languages. So what you can do is you could log what's on the event, and that's going to include the native exception, so that like vanilla JavaScript exception, for example, as well as additional information that the Sentry SDK was looking for, like the URL it came from, or the host name. And you can basically decide in here that if there's something you don't like about it, then you can just do return null. So if you return null, then the Sentry SDK will not send this event across the internet to Sentry.io, and it will just get dropped to the client app side. So you have to consider if it happens a lot, it's something you have to consider. If you want to know about it, then maybe let it get through to Sentry, set a filter there. Otherwise, you can drop it here. This brings us to our next point on data scrubbing. You can also modify this event in here. So if there's some kind of information on the tag or somewhere, you can actually just delete it and then still return the event anyways. And something else you can do from here that isn't quite data scrubbing, filter aggregation, but a little bonus. If you remember this modal popping up, this was a user feedback modal written in jQuery that's provided by the Sentry library. But you can actually provide your own modal as well. So if you want to use Sentry's modal, then you can do this and say, okay, in before send, if there's an exception, then show the report dialog, and this will send the feedback to the issue so that you could see it in this user feedback tab here. And if you wanted to use your own modal, then you could just hit our API directly, and our documentation on our API docs will show you how to do that. And in our mobile SDKs, we're actually going to have a function on like the Sentry SDK that's going to allow you to just pass the feedback into it, and that'll make the API call for you. Okay. So that was filtering, data scrubbing, and then grouping from the SDK side as well. So that's another thing you can do in before send. So in this case, what we're doing is we're taking the event, and the hint, by the way, this is just like additional information to help you make a decision and figure out what went wrong. You don't have to use it, but we're looking at the type of exception that came in. We're saying if it was related to a database connection error, then have these get grouped together into the same issue. So it's possible each of these individual events in this issue have slightly different stack traces, but you do have assurance here that they were all database connection errors. So this is good if you're having too many DB connection issues separate from each other, and you want them to get grouped together. Okay, so that was grouping on the client SDK side. Now let's transition into Discover for reporting and analytics and alerts. So the coolest thing about Discover is that it allows you to query your data irrespective of like the issues going on. You could look at metadata across all your millions of events for one project or even all your projects. You might recall in years past that issues was always scoped to the issue. It was a little harder to do like aggregate analysis across like metadata if you wanted to know like all the errors on a server. That might be a little more difficult in issues. We give you some reports by default. I'm going to show you how to build a couple of useful ones from scratch. So if we hit build a new query, we're started off with just an overall event count for a time parameter, and these are not sorted or really aggregated in any particular way. These are individual events. There's no concept of issues just yet. So I'm going to start with a really wide angle view of just wondering what are my projects and what are their counts, how many unique users are affected. So we hit columns here. We're going to say project and count, and then how many unique users are affected, as well as how many unique issues. Was this one issue? Was it several issues? We'll say apply, and we'll open this up to a 7-day count here. And then we'll sort it by clicking on a column. And think of this as like a giant SQL query. So we're selecting some attributes, fields, or columns that will appear here where these conditions are met. So I haven't applied any specific conditions, but that's kind of like the logic and how you can think of it here. So from here, we can see this had the most errors. This had far less, but it had nearly the same amount of unique users affected. This one was also 10 unique issues accounting for those 407,000. So now maybe you want to zoom in a level. Instead of having projects in your table, you want to know like what were some of these unique issues. So you can say add to filter or select it in the drop down here. And now we're selecting attributes where this condition is met. So in this case, we don't need to select projects anymore. We know the project, we selected that. So maybe now we want to know individual issues that happen and how many users were affected. So we apply this. And from here, we can now see that. So I have it for all projects, but you could select individual projects. Or sorry, I do have it for one project here. Okay. So now we can still see what is happening the most or not. Let's actually choose this one here at 79,000, and maybe we want to look at individual events for this. So there's a couple ways you could do it. You can click Open Stack, and then you can see the individual events here. And notice this essentially set the issue title for you here as one of like those where clause conditions in the big query that's going on. Another way you could do it is add to filter right here. And then you would just have to select different columns. So in this case, I'll get a little more specific. I'll say, what was the message? Server name, just going to pick some random things. User, if it was set. And then maybe stack file name. Depending on the SDK, it may be recording one of several of these attributes, depending on what like the language or the framework calls it. Is it a package, a module, and so forth? So I recommend experimenting with some of those. We hit apply. Now we can see updated information on those 85,000 errors for that issue of not enough inventory for the wrench. Another neat thing, if you click show tags, you can see the heat map here. If you wanted to know that this was happening from a certain client, you click this, and then that also gets added to here. You'll never mess up someone else's Discover query. You do have to click save. And anytime you find something you like, click save as. These dashed purple lines here, these faint ones, these are actually the releases. You can see over time, was there a release where you had a huge spike in activity? You can click and zoom in on an individual spike. So this looks like a 30-minute period I've zoomed in on, and there was just 1,000 events right there. And you can continue analyzing from here. If this was something you think you might check a lot for, then definitely save it as a report. But a really nice thing is you can hit create alert. So this way, all these parameters that you filled out, you don't have to go like type them in from scratch when you set up the alert. You can just do it from here. So let me just add in event type of error and make sure we're not confusing it with anything. And then select the project again. And then we'll hit create alert. Event type error. I missed something here. Let me just kind of save it. Cool. So now notice it brought in all those parameters I had in Discover. So you can kind of like do a Discover query. And if that's the volume you're comfortable with, then set the metric alert so it's like a little higher than what that query was at and just, adjust to it from there. Okay. I got 2 minutes left. Let me just show you some other common reports that we recommend setting up. So one cool thing is by file name. So if you picked a certain project, you can see what files are having the most errors. Maybe you have some really long files or things that have some debt behind them, need some refactoring. You can see that. Another neat property, I'm just going to kind of hack this report right here. This property transaction actually doesn't refer to like performance transactions. It tends to represent either the endpoint in your app or even like the controller if it's Ruby, like usually something in your framework or MVC, like whatever they use to kind of like componentize or like separate different parts of your app. That's what the transaction property will actually represent. Another thing you can do is errors by URL. So this could be a whole user experience. There could be lots of different files underneath this, but you can see all the errors that occurred on that particular web page or endpoint. And then finally, by any custom tag that you've ever set. So we had a tag for customer type. So from here, you can say, show me all the errors that my trial customers are having or team. So notice we're just saying has customer type, that's the tag, but you can search by anything you wanted to in here. So great. All right, so that's all I have for today. I look forward to your questions that have been piling up in the channel for a live workshop 1 error monitoring. Keep them coming. I'll post a bunch of links to what I presented here and hope you enjoy some of the next sessions. I'll see you there.